Hello, I'm Laurel Wingfield, and I'm back with an abridged version of Chapter 2 of my book, Alice and the Best Friends Forever, Book 1, Jane's Secret. I'll begin reading now. Leo, Dermot, Brian and Joel hated Alice and her friends, who called themselves the best friends forever. They hated Jane, who was just too perfect. But when they had followed her home, taunting her, they had realised suddenly that they were alone, and they couldn't remember what had happened. She was just gone. They had looked at each other in confusion and felt very stupid and angry. They had tried to follow her home a second time, and the same thing had happened. They had intended to run up behind her and push her down onto the pavement hard, and the next thing they knew, she was gone, and they were all standing around, feeling confused. They had asked a passing man if he had seen her, but he hadn't. No one had. That had been back in February. As they had stood there in the middle of the pavement, Leo had announced, "I'm going around to the Archer house tonight and teach that snotty cow a lesson. I'm going to key that big fancy car of theirs and break the windows. You're all coming, yeah?" Brian, Dermot and Joel had agreed to go along with him. They were always up for a bit of vandalism. "I'm going home to get some money for chips," Leo added. "We'll meet at the top of the road at 7 o'clock, yeah? It should be dark by then. We'll get some drink and cigs later." The boys had been happy with that, and had dispersed to their various homes to have whatever was on offer for tea. Leo had gone back to the council flat he shared with his mother and older brother Sean. His mother had been out at work. He had changed out of his school uniform, then looked around the flat for some money. He had found some, stuffed in a pottery jar that said tea on it. His mother had tried to hide it at the back of a cupboard. He had taken the lot, telling himself that if he didn't, Sean would. Leo would buy lager, cider and cigarettes with it, and after wrecking the Archer's car, he and the others would get drunk. The money had been meant to pay for groceries. Down at the chippy, he had bought fish and chips. Then he'd gone to look at the Archer's house. That big, fancy white car of theirs had been sitting in the drive just begging to be customised. It was parked beside a white camper van with tinted windows, which was big enough for a family of 6 to fit in. Then Leo had gone around to the playing fields on the other side of the hedge. He checked that the gap in the railings was still there. As he had walked back across the playing field, he had stopped and looked back towards the Archer's house. The hedge was so tall, all he could see of the house was the roof. By the time he returned to the meeting point, it was 7 o'clock. The others had all come along within a couple of minutes, and had gathered opposite the entrance to the Archer's Road, where there was darkness between 2 street lights. Leo had said, "Let's go," and the boys had followed him, grinning. They had waited on the other side of the road from the Archer's house, watching for any activity, then crossed over and gathered around the car. They had had a hard time keeping quiet, in case they alerted someone in the house. They had to keep stifling giggles. The car and camper van had both seemed to have an unusual glow in the darkness. Somehow, the orange street lighting had seemed to reflect from a transparent second skin over the slightly glowing white painted surfaces of the 2 vehicles. This fact had hardly registered with the boys. They thought nothing of how odd they felt around those 2 vehicles either. It was like they were falling towards the camper van somehow. The boys had looked at Leo, waiting for him to begin the assault. Leo had started at the front of the car and had walked the length of it, scraping the paintwork with the tip of his penknife. Then he had looked back to see the result, and the car was unmarked. He had pressed with all of his might, trying to scrape down to bare metal, but somehow it had felt wrong. He had keyed enough cars to know that it shouldn't have felt like this. The tip of his knife had seemed to glide along the side of the car without touching it, slipping repelled by the surface. There had been no sound either, metal scraping metal. That should not have been possible. The blade of his knife was bent. In disbelief, he had tried again, but still could not damage that car. His penknife broke, the blade snapping at the base. Leo had looked at Dermot and murmured, "Try the window." Dermot had produced a hammer and slammed it against the passenger's side front window with all of his strength. It had bounced off painfully, leaving no mark and making no sound. The hammer had never even connected with the surface. Dermot had cried out, dropped the hammer, and grabbed his right wrist with his left hand. The recoil had been enough to sprain his wrist. Then they had looked towards the house and had seen Mrs. Archer standing on her front doorstep. "Time to go home now, boys," she said. "Oh, and Leo, put the money back in the tea jar. Your mother works very hard to put food in your belly." And then they were back in their own homes, and Leo had been compelled to put the money back, minus what he had spent on his fish and chips. Once again, they had been confused about what had happened. Dermot could not even remember how he had sprained his wrist. There was something not right about the Archer family. They knew that much, enough to decide that the Archers were their enemies. But that June night, they had not followed Jane home. They had followed Alice. They followed far enough back to keep out of sight until creepy Jane left Alice alone. Then they hurried to catch her. It was Leo who began to call, tauntingly, "Alice! Alice!" And the others joined in. She tried to hurry, to reach the safety of her home, but they knew as well as she did that she would never reach it in time. They surrounded her and began their torment. First, the bag throwing, from one to the other over Alice's head, until one of them tossed it into the road and waited for it to be run over. Then one of them would trip Alice, pull her hair, or try to grab her glasses, which would end up in the road with the school bag. Suddenly, they were afraid. Something dark and evil was gliding towards them down the road. It was like a rolling cloud of black smoke with a centre of gravity that held it together. And if it caught them, it would suck out their souls before dissolving their bodies. In that smoke, there was something with glowing red eyes like embers of hellfire, dull black horns, and long black talons, and it would feed on the dissolved substance of what they had been, and somehow they would still be alive. It was something that had come straight up from hell, as if a hole had opened in the pavement, letting it out. In a small, rational part of their minds, they knew that it couldn't be real, but they were not capable of being rational just then. All they knew was that they had to get out of there, and fast. And they ran. They ran for their lives. That was the end of Chapter 2 of Alice and Her Best Friends Forever, Jane's Secret. I hope you enjoyed that, and you'll be back next week for Chapter 3. Until then, take care. Goodbye.